All right, now we have all the building blocks we need to create the testimonial component. So back to our markup, we're going to start with a card. Inside the card, we're going to have a grid, a 2-column grid. So grid double hyphen 1 by 2. Good. Now inside the grid, we have an image and a code component. First, I'm going to add the image. So in the zip file that I gave you at the beginning of this section, you can find the testimonial image in the images folder. Let's drag and drop this onto the images folder. Good. Now we're going to set the source to images/testimonial. Now, as a best practice, we should always set the alt attribute of our images. So what does this image represent? A happy, smiling customer. So we can say a happy, smiling customer. Good. Now, after the image, we have a code component, but I don't want to bring the code component yet. I don't want to bring too much complexity. I want to build this step by step. So temporarily, I want to add a div and give it an inline style. I'm going to give it a height of 100 pixels and a background of gold. Let's make sure that we get the basics right. Then we'll come back and replace this div with a code component. So here's what we get. Now let's resize the browser. Look, the size of the image is not changing. So we're dealing with a fixed size image. Now the problem with this is that at certain breakpoints, we're not going to have an equal distribution of columns. We're not going to have 2 columns, each taking half of the page. Take a look. So on my machine, at this breakpoint, look, right here, at 770 pixels. Can you tell that the image is larger than the second column? So how can we fix this problem? Well, we want to make this image responsive. So currently, our image has a width of 400 pixels. We haven't said this explicitly. This is just the dimension of the image. Now, if we give this image a width of 100%, that means 100% of its container. So if the container becomes larger or smaller, our image will resize accordingly. So here in our markup, we're going to give this image a class. What are we going to call this class? Testimonial __ image. And that means we should also apply this class here. So this is the main element that represents our component. Okay. Now let's open up our style sheet and define a new section for testimonials. First, I'm going to define a rule for our testimonial and apply a padding of 3 rems. Because in this design, we have some padding around the content of the grid. Okay. Next, we're going to define a rule for our testimonial image. And here we're going to set the width to 100%. Now take a look. So we have equal distribution of columns. And if we resize the browser, our image also gets resized. And at all times, we always have 2 equal columns. Great. So we have solved the first problem. Now, currently, I cannot see the boundary of our card. So I want to go to our markup and temporarily apply a padding to our body element so we have less space for the card and we can see the actual card. So over here, just as a temporary solution, we're going to set an inline style to apply some padding. Again, we don't want to do this for any serious projects. So here's what we get. We can clearly see our card. Great. Now, the next thing we want to add is this icon. Now, how are we going to implement this? Well, this icon should always be in this position. So here we want to use absolute positioning. And to achieve that, we want to put this image and the icon inside a container, which is relatively positioned. Then we'll apply absolute positioning on the icon. So it's always in this location. So here's our image element. We're going to put this inside a container with a class of, what are we going to call this? Well, we can call this testimonial image. Now, what's going to happen to the actual image? Well, we're going to remove this class from the image. And then back to our style sheet, we have to make a tiny change here. We're going to target the image that is directly inside this container. So image. So see, this is a good case for using the direct child selector. In the second part of this series, I told you that most of the time you shouldn't avoid this because you don't want your CSS to know about your markup. Because if the markup changes, then you'll have to come back and update the CSS as well. But I believe this is like an exceptional case because it's very unlikely that we're going to change the structure of this container. If you don't like this approach, you can come back here and give this container a different class like testimonial image container, and then apply the testimonial image class to the image element. That's another solution. But I think that would be too many classes, so I'm just going to go with the direct child selector. Let's make sure everything works up to this point. So I'm going to resize the browser, and we have a responsive image. Great. Now we're going to add the icon and use absolute positioning. So first we need to enable relative positioning on the container, which is testimonial image. Here we're going to set the position to relative. Good. Now to add the icon, we're going to pull up our icon template and copy this markup. Now back to index.html. I'm going to add the icon right after the image. Good. Now to position the icon container, once again, I'm going to use the direct child selector. Again, we could give this a separate class, but I find this unnecessary. So we're going to define another rule and say, in our testimonial image, we're going to target the icon container and set its position property to absolute. Then we're going to set the top to, let's say, 3 rams and right to 0. Let's see what we get up to this point. Okay, here's our icon. Now we need to shift it to the right. Now I want you to pay attention to something. If you look at the design mockup, the right edge of the image is exactly in the middle of the icon, in the middle of the circle. How can we guarantee this? Well, for sizing these icons, we have used pixels, which are absolute values. So earlier we set the size of this icon to 64 pixels. So if we divide this by 2, we'll get 32 pixels. We can use that as an offset to correctly position the icon. So back to our new rule. Instead of setting the right to 0, we're going to set the right offset to 32 pixels. That is 64 divided by 2. All right, now look. Well, our icon moved to the left, so we have to use a negative value here. So back to our style sheet. Let's use negative 32 pixels. And now our icon is exactly in the right position. And this is not dependent on the size of the screen. So if I make my browser wider or more narrow, our icon is always in the right location. Now, what about the color? Well, we can create variations of this icon container, so we can give it different skins. So back to the icon section of our style sheet, this is where we defined the basic icon container rule. We're going to define a skin for this component. We can say icon container, double hyphens, accent. So here we're going to use our accent color. We set the background to color accent. Good. Now we can use this new class in our testimonial. So here's icon container. We're going to add the second class, which is icon container accent. Let's make sure it works. Great. Now we need to change the color of the icon to blue. Once again, we're going to create a variation of the icon class. So here's our SVG element. Currently, we're using icon primary, which displays the icon in blue. We're going to create a new class called icon white. So back to our style sheet. This is where we define the icon primary rule. Now let's define a new rule, icon white, and here we set fill to white. Good. Now we can apply this new class over here. Perfect. Now one last thing is to replace the WordPress icon with quotes. Let's take a look. Perfect. The only problem is the size of the icon. If you compare it with our design mockup, you can see the icon here is a little bit smaller. So once again, we can create another variation of the icon class. So once again, in the icon section, we're going to define another skin and call it icon small. Here we can set the width to 30 pixels and height to 30 pixels as well. Now, back to our markup, we're going to apply that class right here, icon small. Let's see. That looks great to me. We're almost done. The last part is adding the quote component. So back to index.html. This is where we added a temporary div. I'm going to delete this line. Now, let's go to the template for our codes, copy all this code, and then paste it right here. Now, let's verify. Good. The only problem I have here is the size of the font for a screen of this size. So what is the breakpoint here? It's around 800 pixels. If you go wider than 1024 pixels, the font becomes smaller. But But for tablets, I think the font is a little bit too big and we don't have enough words on each line. So here in the testimonial section, we're going to define a new media query for tablets. Once again, we're going to use the standard breakpoint. And here we're going to set a few rules. The first one is for a quote inside a testimonial component. So our quote should have a font size of 2.1 rems. Let's take a look. That's better. We have more text on each line, but the name of the author is way too big. I want to use the same font size for the author. So let's just reuse this style for testimonial, quote, author. See, this is the benefit of BEM convention. We can clearly see the components and their elements. Now, back here, that looks good. Now, if you look at our design mockup, you can see we have more space here. We can implement this by adding a left margin to our quote component. So over here, we're going to define another rule, testimonial quote, and we're going to apply a left margin of 6 rems. Take a look. Okay, that's better. And everything looks great for wide screens. And on mobile, we get a 1-column layout. So we can spend more time on customizing this and making sure it looks great. For example, currently our icon is a little bit cut off. This is because of the overflow that we applied to the cart component early on. I'm not going to spend any more time on this because it's going to be repetitive. So I'm going to leave it up to you to fine-tune this component.